Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second edition of eMissions Talks webinar series, hosted by Process Ecology. I'm Sophia Alva, your host for today, and today we'll be talking about the top-down and bottom-up quantifications and how these two different data sets can and should be integrated to achieve our emissions reduction goals. As many of you know, there is a need to reconcile the data between the top-down and bottom-up estimations. This is a recurring challenge that oil and gas professionals are facing on a global scale. Top-down measurements are becoming more and more advanced and accurate, which has led many to think that there is no need for inventories or engineering estimates, since we're all able to detect leaks at any point in time. This, however, is incorrect. And despite the advancements in top-down measurements, there is still a requirement for the process operation to be fully understood and to find the root cause of these emission sources at ground level. Today, we're here to explore these challenges and shed light on what they mean for the industry. But before we dive in, let's briefly introduce our speakers. Joining us today are experts from Process Ecology, Jairo Duran, our process research engineer, who has a background in scheduling and project optimization and has recently been focusing his research on top-down data sets. We also have Alberto Alva, our CEO, whose background focuses on chemical engineering and process optimization for sustainability. Welcome.
Thank you for having me today. I'm very glad to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you, and welcome everybody. It's this is what I'm hoping is going to be the start of a very interesting, fruitful conversation.
Now, Jairo and Alberto will provide their insights on the topic with a quick presentation. Please feel free to be submitting your questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentation, and we will get to these questions at the end of the presentation. So we'll bring up the presentation now, and Jairo will start.
Thanks, Sophia. Yeah, and yeah, please don't forget, don't hesitate in asking questions. This is very much an ongoing discussion, what we're going to talk about today. And next slide, please. So essentially today, we want to discuss on the role of top-down methane estimates and measurements, and what's the role of those into an effective mitigation management strategy. So top-down has been the news recently in the last 3-4 years. We're getting better and better. So it's a good point to start thinking, oh, okay, how we can incorporate all of those into our strategies. And of course, how we can combine, maybe reconcile that with the existing bottom-up estimates that we may have. So let's start to talk about a little bit of context on methane. Just next slide, please. We already know methane is a potent greenhouse gas. I just want to mention here in this slide that I have here in this pie chart about this is methane emissions for 2023. About 42% of this is natural origin. So there is not a lot that we can do technologically speaking about that right now. But the other roughly 60% is from human activities. So we can do a lot to tackle and abate these methane emissions. So speaking strictly about energy, the energy industry, The energy industry can take leadership because we know how to do this kind of projects, and the technologies are there. So it's important to know that the oil and gas industry in particular is very well prepared to get rapid emission reductions. But all starts with a good inventory. So we need to know what are our emissions, where are the main sources of methane in our assets. So let's talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. So how these methane inventories are typically built, and what's the role of top-down measurements now? Next slide, please. So on the left side of this slide, we have the bottom-up estimates. There is still a misconception that a bottom-up estimate is just using average emission factors and activity levels. That's not entirely true. Of course, that's the easy and perhaps the cheap way to do it, but we can improve and do much more with these estimates using process data, using having a deep knowledge of the process, applying engineering calculation and thermodynamics. And that way we can predict and get very good estimates of the methane emissions at your facility. So yeah, bottom-up estimates are there. This is basically what the industry uses. But now we have the top-down. That's what I have on the right-hand side. So top-down emission estimates are basically remote measurements of methane. So the classical method to measure methane is a spectroscopy. We can mount these kind of measurement devices in satellite, airplanes, cameras. And that's the way, like, basically we are overwhelmed these days with data of this type for different oil and gas facilities. So how can we use this data and incorporate that into our emission strategy? So next slide, please. So yeah, so essentially we have these two sources of information. Let's start by talking about satellite data. So for satellites, you see here in these slides a lot of well-known names. There are about 25 to 30 initiatives, both from private organizations and governments. But all these methane measurement initiatives we can classify that basically into two different areas. Two different types: area flux mappers and point source imagers. The flux mappers are going to take pictures of, let's say, 5 by 5, 10 by 10 kilometers in precision and resolution. So those are good measurements for, let's say, country level inventories, regional level. In the past, researchers have applied these measurements for some oil producing regions, for example, in the Permian Basin and some others. So essentially, these type of instruments are not really good at giving us detail or pinpointing sources of methane in a facility, but just a general picture of what's going on in a certain region. On the other hand, the point source imagers are getting better every day in giving us more resolution. So right now, GHGSat or Carbon Mapper can take images of 25, 30 meters by 30 meters. So with that information, we can pinpoint not only super emitters, but we can say with some certainty where our emissions are coming from at equipment level even. So yeah, it's a wonderful that we're getting more precise data for methane using satellites. Of course, there are problems, and that's what I want to talk about: airplanes and drones. Um, Mounting this measurement equipment in airplanes and drones give us the advantage of being closer to the source. So we're gonna get more precise methane estimates. Also, this is easier to deploy. So basically, if you want to commission a measurement campaign in a group of facilities or a single facility even, that's something that you can do with this airplane technology, not with satellites, for example. It's gonna be a little bit more complicated. So over time, we're getting better and better also with aerial measurements using, for example, LiDAR. One example here locally has been Bridger Photonics doing an excellent job at looking at different facilities in Western Canada. So at the end, we have different sources for methane measurements. I like to bring this figure from Collins and collaborators. This is showing different emission sources from the oil and gas industry, typical equipment like dehyes, compressors, chemical pumps, and in the y-axis we have methane emissions. So everything comes down to detection limits. So essentially with satellites, the best satellites these days can measure up to 100 kilograms per hour of methane. So that's good enough to give us super emitters perhaps, but it's not gonna give us the average or even the maximum flow rates of these typical processes. For airplanes, that's gonna give us even more precision, but still you can see in this graph that we're not gonna capture all the emissions that are happening in our facility. At the end, we are going, or at least at this point in time, we have to rely on ground-based data. So that's gonna give us the last word in terms of small sources of methane. And at the end, the accumulation of those small sources is gonna give us like a big contributions in our methane emissions inventory. The last thing I want to say, next slide, please, about top-down measurements and estimates, is that the instrument is going to give us the detection, presence or absence of methane. And it's going to give us the methane concentration, parts per billion of that molecule. But it's not going to give us flow rates. And at the end, flow rates is what we need to build our inventories and to build our mitigation strategy. So in between, what happens is some kind of modeling. So typical models are usually complex in mathematics, mass transfer modeling involving different variables, meteorological parameters, temperatures, wind velocities. There are different approaches to calculate flow rates, and each one of them is going to give you different levels of uncertainty. So that's something to keep in mind all the time when we have top-down estimates. That's what I have to tell you about top-down. So I'm going to pass it on to Alberto, who's going to talk about the bottom-up estimates and how to improve them. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, no, thank you, Jairo, for that overview on the top-down estimation approaches. And probably people will notice we're stressing that word of estimation, when not just for bottom-up, but for top-down. Again, because we want to make sure that that's very clear that they're both estimates, and when one talks about direct measurement versus bottom-up estimate, maybe a little bit misleading. Like I said, reality they're both estimates, and each one would have its own strengths and weaknesses. But yeah, let me talk a little bit more about the bottom-up. So this, as Jairo mentioned, there's different levels of types of bottom-up estimation. For example, the IPCC tiers 1, 2, and 3, and then there's different ways to create these inventories using bottom-up. But for now, let me just go with the most accurate estimates we can come up with for bottom-up, which is what Jairo describes, really based on first principles, thermodynamics, mass and energy balances, and in general, process simulation. So rigorous process simulation models are used to create these bottom-up inventories. Now, clearly, one of the main or the main reason we're having this type of conversation is because there's been many reports in the literature across multiple basins indicating that significant gap between these estimates, with the top-down being consistently higher than the bottom-up, 2, 3 times, 5 times. There's been all kinds of different reports. But there's clearly a trend where the top-down is saying, oh, look, the bottom-up is underestimating emissions, and they're actually much higher than we think. So let me just go back to those bottom-up inventories because, and maybe this is not a historical feature of these inventories. Currently, they are being developed mostly for regulatory reporting purposes. That kind of regulation started driving a lot of this activity. However, what that implies is that these models or these bottom-up estimations have been using annual averages to come up with emissions estimates. Now, comparing an inventory based on an annual average situation with these more instantaneous estimates from the top down, and comparing them, trying to make sense between them, I mean, it presents big challenges. First of all, because the temporal scale is just so completely different between these two approaches. So that on its own brings some difficulties. And having said that, there's going to be several reasons why we are seeing this discrepancy. The most obvious one, I guess, in my mind, would be leaks, right? Because again, the bottom-up type of modeling, there's no easy way really to detect or estimate or predict when a component is going to start leaking. So that contribution is certainly part of that. But in addition, we propose that a good portion of that gap that we're seeing is due to the dynamic nature of oil and gas operations. Again, an annual average is not going to represent well these dynamics of the processes that would be contributing to this difference. And just as a very simple example, consider, for example, a separator, simple separator dumping liquid into a tank. And again, now when we're talking about an instantaneous emissions event, there's several factors coming in. So the composition of the fluids involved at that time, dumping out of that separator, the response of the control system, the actuation of the valves. So when this is happening, there is a chance that there's going to be an emissions event when that liquid hits the tank. And I'm going to say, even if the tank is equipped with a VRU, with a vapor recovery system or something like that, a control tank, there's still a chance that this event is going to cause the pressure in the tank to increase suddenly, which may result in a thief hatch opening, a PVRV opening, which is an emissions event, right? And by the way, I mean, this is why these devices are installed. So we want them to open because it's to protect the integrity of the equipment, for safety reasons, for the personnel, and so on. So this equipment is designed to operate like that, and these devices are going to open. Again, this may be a short-lived event, depending on the response of the compressor, or the sometimes there's offsets, so it could be a few minutes that this is going on, and that's going to create an emission event. So, of course, those types of emissions are never to be seen in an annual average for a bottom-up inventory. So now to capture these contributions and get closer and start closing that gap from all these dynamic related events, we need to really be able to understand the root causes, first of all, for these emissions events. And what we propose is that the best way to identify these type of events and the root causes of these events is by using real-time process models. And these process models are the same models we're using for the bottom-up. It's just that now the data coming from the SCADA systems is going to be so much more frequent that now we're able to track these emissions events. And like I said initially, not only track them, but identify the root causes for these events. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've done a very super quick analysis of this top-down, bottom-up. So where does that leave us in terms of our emissions management activities? Where is the path forward? So like Jairo was noting, the detection of methane has improved significantly over the recent years. And really, technology for both top-down and bottom-up will continue to improve, which is great. So we're being able to find better numbers for our emission profiles. The one thing I'll say here is the ultimate objective of everything we're doing in this field is mitigation, right? We should not lose track that emission reduction is the ultimate goal here. And that, yes, the better inventories we get, the better decisions we're going to be able to make in how to deploy capital or whatever operating practices and so on to get to that goal of emission reduction. So now a hybrid approach really is what we're looking at here. So now the challenge, of course, remains how do we combine this top-down with bottom-up to provide that pathway. I mean, root cause analysis is going to be essential. So our point of view here is that a missing piece of this puzzle was this temporal scale, addressing the temporal scale. And we're proposing to do that with real-time bottom-up models. And again, these are process simulation models consuming data from the SCADA systems, tracking emissions in real time. And now we have a much better chance of identifying what exactly was happening at the facility when that plane, with that drone, whenever something was detected. And then we can start closing those gaps with which with better data. So next slide, please. And let me just say here, almost as a concluding remark, a reconciled inventory, or what's being called also a measurement informed inventory, again, the way we're understanding the problem now is not going to be a solution where some sources are measured by top down, some sources are calculated, and then we add them all up. We think there's a need for a true reconciliation of these data sets that are going to come up with a new set of estimates that are going to give us a much better, realistic picture of really what's going on at these facilities, which then is again going to inform root cause analysis, is going to inform how do we prioritize sources, and finally, is going to inform how we deploy capital, what actions we take for our ultimate goal, which is emissions reduction. So I'll just finalize to say that we're currently deploying some digital platforms at several facilities and fine-tuning those algorithms to reconcile top-down measurements with the dynamics of the process behavior, with the root cause analysis and identification of these root causes. Again, it's still a little bit early to report much of this, but stay tuned. We will be reporting back to you as we find additional insights in this challenging and interesting area. So I think I'm going to leave it there for now and see if there's any questions.
Great. Thank you, Jairo and Alberto. That was very insightful. Before we open the questions to the audience, I don't know if anybody has submitted any questions, but I will ask some of the questions that stood out. And yeah, hopefully we can get to some questions at the end here. So I will start with Alberto. What are the benefits and challenges in both types of emission estimation approaches?
Good question. I think one needs to recognize, again, this has been an evolving field, and it's rapidly moving field lately. The bottom-up inventories, again, historically driven by regulatory pressures, and they were great to provide sources of mitigation and actions, right? I mean, we saw a lot of activity. There was a 45% reduction of methane here in Alberta reported by 2021, I believe. And that was thanks to those bottom-up estimates. Now, of course, as we need additional reductions. The urgency keeps increasing. Now we have to continue on this path of continuous improvement. Really, new technology comes into the picture, and now we have to adjust. So again, the bottom up has been very useful so far, but now we need to move on from there. Top down. I mean, detection is unbelievable these days. I think there's still some challenges on the quantification because of the modeling step that Jairo was saying and the uncertainties. But again, detection is unbelievable and it keeps improving quickly. So I think at this point, management strategy needs to make use of all we have in our toolbox. So they both have these great strengths. Again, the bottom up helping us to identify root causes of emissions events. So this is kind of in general what I see from both types of measurements. Don't know, Jairo, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, essentially, I believe the top-down estimates have been like a lot in the news recently. So we need to take some of the claims, these providers give us with a little bit of grain of salt. But I think what's most important at the end of the day is the consolidation of all this wealth of data, either from process, from top-down estimates, and how we make with that a very concise and a very comprehensive inventory that help us at the end to construct a pathway for mitigation. That's the ultimate goal of all this job is not getting the best, most precision methane measurement. It is to tackle and reduce methane emissions.
Great, thank you. Jairo, so how do you make sense of these multiple different, these two different data sets, especially when they're extremely different? How do you bring them together and make sense of that?
Yeah, I feel like the first step is to get a little bit of knowledge to learn about how these different approaches work. And I feel like this webinar, for example, is a good first step. Then look at different sources of literature to understand how these estimates, what are the pros and cons of different ways to measure methane, what are the limits on each approach. And at the end is all trickles down to what are my needs, what are my facilities doing. um, we know that, for example, time is very important for oil and gas operations. So if I have a snapshot of a methane measurement taken by a satellite or an airplane, so is that all my emissions, is that continuous all over the year, or that's just an event that happened for some particular process reason? So time dimension is also important in this quest.
Yeah,
Any additional thoughts, Alberto, on that?
let me jump in there. And you know what? I think again from our process engineering practice that's been, we've been doing this type of work for many years. And the issue of data reconciliation, it has been around for a while. Now, of course, the data sets are larger and there's additional uncertainties that we need to consider. But this situation where you have multiple measurements or calculations, giving you conflicting um, indications of what's going on in your process. That's been around for a while, and I think we need to, take a step back, bring that science into the problematic we're facing here, and start looking at how we can adjust those algorithms that are well known to help us come up with a better estimate. That's what I was trying to say in my final slide, that this data reconciliation is to consider, let's bring all that science into the picture and let's find that, estimate that is actually going to satisfy, the some of the things that we know are not going to change, mass and energy conservation, physics, all these things have to be the driver for us to arrive at that new, better estimate.
Great, thank you. So next question. How is this information beneficial for emissions reporting or mitigation efforts? Alberto, I think, or Jairo, actually. Yeah, let's go with Jairo.
Yeah, no problem. That's at the end, emissions reporting. So either oil and gas companies do this for, regulatory compliance, of course. But I feel like having a very comprehensive inventory is super important to have like a clear pathway. Okay, so where are my emissions located? Where do I spend my dollars for mitigation efforts? So having a very good inventory is not just for, to show to the government that, okay, we have a clear picture here of what's going on, but it's also internally it's gonna help me to have a clear idea. Okay, am I being energy efficient? Am I being like as efficient as it could be in terms of let's say productivity, not only emissions? So these kind of things, having or relying on data informed inventories is great, not only from the point of view of emissions, but also in how effective I am being in terms of process. So I don't know, Alberto, if you want to jump in also in this part of the discussion.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, like we said, we've been working on this for many years, and it's just a challenging and sometimes fascinating problem we're looking at. But again, the easy picks of for methane mitigation were achieved already. Right. So once you've done all the replacement for your pneumatics or things that were more clear to industry for emission reduction, now we're facing this situation where every facility will have its unique pathway. Because again, every facility has its unique characteristics, constraints, challenges. And so when you get to that point, now we need to start bringing this type of data-driven, measurement-informed inventories to provide us that pathway to make effective use of capital and other resources in our mitigation efforts. The only other thing I will say is that the discussion whether one number is right versus the other one is wrong, I think that's just a distracting way from that ultimate goal we've been talking about. So if we can as a community arrive at these solutions, then we can move away from that debate as to, oh no, it's top down right, bottom up is incorrect, blah blah blah, and just say, okay, you know what, here is the best estimate, we all agree, stakeholders can agree, even in the more general communities, financial communities, you name it, and then move forward without those distractions.
Great, thank you. So one last question before we start answering the audience's questions. I see there's a few in there. Feel free to send in your questions and we'll get to them. So with everything that you guys have said, how can producers today start preparing for this type of more accurate emissions management and reporting that you guys are suggesting? Alberto, you can start.
Yeah, no, I can start. I can start with that. I mean, one of the biggest challenges, it was already a challenge with just bottom-up inventories, but it's just the massive amount of data that needs to be managed and handled. So I would say, this ties really nicely with all these kind of digitalization efforts that we're seeing in industry, in our industry and in other industries, because that ability and that capacity to handle big data is going to be essential, right? So digital platforms, databases, open systems. We're talking about these data lakes. There's a lot of this happening for other reasons in the industry as well. So I think that those initiatives should be combined with this, emissions and sustainability initiatives to kind of pull resources, because I think that's going to be a big piece of the solution.
Yeah. Also, I want to include there, like the oil and gas industry has been always characterized by being the leader in terms of process modeling, optimization. So I believe we have a say on how we deal with these huge volumes of data. I believe we have the know-how, we have the tools for handling all this information, and essentially my advice will be to learn how to automate, because a lot of these tasks, reconciling the data, gathering the data, organizing, consolidating, all that requires some level of consolidation. Of some level of automation. So automating this task is critical for some of these emissions management strategies.
Great, thank you so much. Now we will open the floor to our audience. Please feel free to ask any questions as we get through these, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. If we don't get to them, we can send an email response after. So, yeah, one of you can choose to answer.
Yeah, no, I see a question here. Karen, thank you for that question. And this has been, of course, part of the analysis that has to be done on top down. And the question is, are top-down measurements fully accounting for other methane sources that may be in the area, natural, biological, and so on, other than oil and gas? And I mean that's a great question because again two things. The detection, like we said, is really good. The quantification has got some uncertainties, sometimes really large uncertainties. And what we've seen is that there's been an attempt to baseline those measurements by taking into account what would be called background methane that's naturally in the area. However, that again brings another difficulty into interpreting these results because those are also temporarily variable. So again, even if you do some initial baselining of what's methane it's already around without your oil and gas operation, that can change in time. Have you seen some of that, Jairo, in the top-down estimates?
Yeah, I have seen like there are different, in particular for other industries, not oil and gas, but agriculture, waste sector. There are several government initiatives from the European Union, the US EPA, and all of them come to the conclusion, okay, we need to get, so measurements are getting better. We need to get a consensus on how to break down this industry or economic sectors emissions and essentially allocate responsibilities to each sector. So I feel like there has been good progress, but there is a lot of work to be done still in this area. I have another question here from Mahat. He's asking about, so we discussed a lot about venting. What about flare detections using satellite data or airplanes? So if anything, I believe flare detection and quantification is even better than methane. Because methane quantification requires LiDAR, spectroscopy in the infrared region. So that's a little bit challenging. But for flaring data, because it's radiating heat, that's even easier to observe and quantify. And I know, for example, the United Nations and the World Bank, they have a good initiative on measuring flares, not only for oil and gas, but for other industry. And that data is free. So companies can go to, I believe, the website of the Payne Institute of the Colorado School of Mines. You can go to that website, download it, and analyze it. So flare is a big component of emission inventory. So certainly there is data and good data available for people who's looking after that.
Okay, I think we have time for one more or two more questions.
One more. I have here one more from Dylan. He says, great discussion, Alberto and Jairo. How do you see methane emission estimates evolving in non-venting sources, such as stationary combustion? That's a complex. So I was discussing about small sources. Sometimes we call that leaks. So the US EPA, for example, calls any methane source lower than 3 kilograms per hour is a small leak. So catching that with an airplane or with satellite is at this point is almost impossible. So the only way to catch that level, that small emission leak, is basically you have to go with ground cameras or continuous measurement systems. That's possible, but that takes a lot of effort. Detecting these small scale leaks or emission rates is, let's say, not very cost effective, but certainly doable. So hopefully in the upcoming years, once we get better and better in scaling these top-down solutions, we can incorporate the small contributions of, let's say, stationary combustion devices. For example, methane sleep is a big one in combustion engines. We can incorporate those more easily into comprehensive inventories.
Yeah, no, the great question, Dylan. And the other thing I was thinking when Jairo was talking was I mean, you're asking, can the emission factors, for example, for methane slip, be improved based on these newly available top-down estimates? And I think definitely there's an opportunity to do that. There's some complex sources like this methane slip. Again, trying to do when we do that from a bottom-up approach, we're doing, stoichiometry of the combustion, checking the O2 in the stack, and but uncombusted methane remains a challenging thing to predict. So as we, as a community, aggregate more and more of this data, again, that will be another, challenge, because sometimes the data is not available to everybody, so that, a big statistical analysis could be performed and issue some correction factors for this type of sources. I think that would be a great development if we manage to get to that common data set that could be used for the benefit of all the sector. So in principle, it should be possible. It's just going to be a matter of how can we aggregate and find that data.
Great, thank you. I think we are running out of time for questions here. So Alberto and Jairo, do you have any final thoughts before we end this session?
Yes. Yeah, just my main takeaway from this discussion so far has been we have to leverage the wealth of data that we have available these days. So not only top-down measurements from satellites, airplanes, we also have been capturing data for years, and that is process data. So SCADA systems from our instruments, we are capturing data, and that data is often being lost. So why not use it to get a better emission profile or better emission estimates that can at the end give us a clear pathway on how to mitigate GHG emissions. So I think that's my main takeaway from this discussion.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think, I don't know, the kind of final words, in the top of my mind, it's always this situation that we just, I keep coming back to this as a community. We have to be, aware of the limitations and benefits of different approaches and how to make it better. But also how we, carry out these conversations. Sometimes the approaches or the methodologies can become quite technical. So let's say, I don't know, if I'm looking at this as a policymaker, I may not fully understand the nuances of, the uncertainties of the atmospheric models versus the thermodynamics and things like that. And maybe this is more of a personal thing I'll share with you. But again, I like us to talk about bottom-up estimates and top-down estimates because that's what they are. Without trying to convey additional information, whether the direct measurements may be the real value and the bottom-up is just an estimate. So kind of just being careful in the narrative that we use around these things. Because as we know, once something gets into policy, then that's it. We have to live with it for a while. So I think that's what I would use for my closing remarks. But thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. A big thank you to Jairo and Alberto for sharing your expertise with us today. We will be having our next webinar in November, so stay tuned for more information on the topic and date. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.